changed in the new rule. That will talk about lead and copper sampling, outreach and public education, the lead service line inventory, the lead service line replacement plan, and then finally we'll finish up with corrosion control treatment and water quality parameters. So some background, the original lead and copper rule was put into effect in 1991. In 2007, there were some short-term revisions published by the US EPA. The rule was supposed to come out in 2014 with an update of revisions, but Flint, Michigan had issues with lead in their system that made the national news media, and so the rule was pulled back and some revisions were made to it before it was going to be published. In 2015, the EPA put out some white paper recommendations for changes they would suggest being made going forward. And then finally, at the end of 2021, the lead and copper rule revisions, called the LCRR, was published in the Federal Register. The final rule was considered effective December 16th of 2021, and the compliance date for the new lead and copper rule revisions was October 16th of 2024. One thing to keep in mind, we are going to be going for compliance with the new lead and copper rule for 2024, but EPA has also announced the lead and copper rule improvements. There's going to be additional changes to the rule with a target of October 2024. The focus of this improvement rule is going to be focused on replacing all lead service lines in the system as quickly as feasible. Additional compliance tap sampling. How do we find the best sample that has the lead in the system? Some clarification on action and trigger levels, and do we need a trigger level if lead service lines are being replaced, or does the trigger level become the action level for lead, or things that are under discussion? And then also prioritizing historically underserved communities. That target date is that it should come out by the compliance date with the LCRR of October 2024. The improvement rule will come out there, clarifying stuff and making some changes as well. Now, a little background on the rule, because the news media at times does get information wrong. Typically, there is no lead in the water leaving the treatment plant. So neither the groundwater source or the surface water source has any lead in it. Typically, there's little to no lead in the water in the transmission mains going to the consumer's home. So that distribution main typically doesn't have any lead. There are some older distribution mains that have lead in them at the joints, but typically if the transmission main's in good shape, that lead wasn't actually exposed to the water. Typically, the first place that lead would be picked up would be from the water main through the service line going to the customer's home. There could be a lead gooseneck, there could be a full lead service line, there could be a partial service line either on the public or the private side, and then going into the home itself. And then finally, the last place that lead can leach into the water is through the household plumbing. So you could have copper pipe with lead soldering, you could have brass fixtures that have a high lead content, and that would be the last bit of the system where most of the lead is picked up. For the lead rule background, health risks associated with lead, everybody gets this from the news media and from online sources and US EPA, and the language that you have to do if you do have a lead violation. We know that delays in physical and mental development of children are a big issue with lead. It's one of the reasons why lead paint was removed from homes and from toys. But it also can cause issues with adults, both kidney and high blood pressure issues. So it can really affect everyone. Multiple organizations in the US have come out with information on the lead rule background. The CDC came out and said there is no safe blood level in children that exists for lead. The EPA has come out and said too much lead in children can cause lasting problems with growth and development. The National Drinking Water Association said lead can pose health risks to anyone. One thing to keep in mind, when the original rule was put into effect back in 1991, there was a maximum contaminant level goal for lead that was 0 milligrams per liter at the time. So even back originally in 1991, when the original rule was put out there, the goal was always to try to get to 0 lead if possible. Part of the copper rule background, there are health risks associated with drinking copper. They can be stomach, they can be liver, they can be kidney problems. Copper, obviously, if you see copper pipe, you can see corrosion with the typical blue-green corrosion on the inside of the pipe, which can lead to high levels of copper in the water itself. And then obviously we drink Moscow mules with copper in them as well, so you can see that in the copper. One thing to keep in mind is you might want a drink or two after seeing all the new changes to the lead and copper rule, because there's a lot of changes that you're going to have to comply with. So under the current rule, the action level in 1991 was set at 0.015 milligrams per liter, which is also the same as 15 parts per billion. And the copper action level was set at 1.3 milligrams per liter. The 2024 action level is going to stay the same for lead, so it's going to stay at that 15 parts per billion, and copper is going to stay at 1.3 milligrams per liter. What is added in the new 2024 rule is a trigger level. Lead will now have a trigger level of 10 parts per billion, which will trigger additional actions that you have to take. Copper in the new 2024 rule does not have a trigger level. But there's a lot of other changes in the lead and copper rule revisions. There's changes to your sampling plans. There's changes to outreach and public education. There's lead service line inventories. There's lead service line replacement plans. There's what's corrosion control treatment. And so we'll cover each of those individually. So just like before, in the 2024 rule and the 1999 rule, the lead and copper rule is an action level. So it's the 90th percentile value to determine compliance with the action level. What that does is, based on the size of your distribution system, you're going to collect the right number of samples from your system. The simple samples are then categorized from lowest to highest, and you take the value 9/10 of the way up the list, that 90th percentile, and that's to determine if you have compliance with the action level. What that means is you might possibly have some samples over the action level in your system. So maybe your highest sample is at 20 parts per billion, but your 90th percentile action level is 10. So just keep in mind that the action level doesn't mean that every system sample is going to be below the regulation. It does allow for 10% to be above that action level. Now, in the new 2024 rule, the lead and copper rule says if you have an action level violation, you're required now to do distribution of public education within 24 hours. The EPA's idea behind this is getting that information out to the consumer as quickly as possible that there's been a lead violation in the system. The reason for that is a customer might be able to actually take steps to protect themselves. If they have young children, they can go out and buy pitcher filters to remove lead from the water that they cook and drink with. So this is going to trigger stuff for those systems. It can be multiple ways to notify the customer within 24 hours. So that's to let customers know: radio, TV ads, newspaper, website, email, reverse 911 phone calls. So you're going to have to decide in your community, how are you going to get that information out as quickly as possible to the community to let them know that you've had an action level violation within 24 hours. In addition, because you've had an action level violation, you'll have to go back to sampling your full number of taps in the system and doing it every 6 months. Also, if you've had an action level violation, you're going to have to install corrosion control treatment if you don't already have it. Or if you do have corrosion control treatment, you're going to have to re-optimize and then install that treatment. Under the new 2024 rule, we'll talk more about it, but only pH or a corrosion inhibitor are acceptable corrosion control treatments in the new rule. It also is going to trigger immediately that you start to do lead service line replacement in your system. With an action level violation, it mandates that you replace a minimum of at least 3% of your lead service lines per year, and you have to do it for a minimum of 2 years while you're out of compliance. If you immediately get back into compliance, you are still going to complete those 2 years of 3% lead service line replacements, even if it was only one set that went over the action level and you then go back into compliance. You are still going to be mandated to do that replacement. The trigger level is determined the same way as the action level. So those same samples that you pull from the system, you're going to do the list from lowest to highest. And at that 90th percentile, that number will qualify for both your action level and your trigger level. The trigger level for lead being 10 parts per million. So if that number that you report for your 90th percentile is 10 or higher, you'll have a trigger level violation. That trigger level is going to require additional planning, monitoring, and corrosion control treatment in your system. If you have a trigger level violation for lead, you're going to have to do distribution of public education, but now instead of 24 hours, it's going to be within 30 days to notify the public that you had a trigger level violation. You're going to go back to annual tap monitoring sampling. So you're going to sample every year at the full number of samples. One of the things that you're going to have to do before 2024 comes into play is you're going to have to create a lead service line replacement plan for your system. And we'll talk about that further, but you're going to have to get state approval for your lead service line replacement plan, and then you're going to have to replace lead service lines at that rate that's in your plan for a minimum of 2 years after a trigger violation. What that means is you could possibly approve with the state a 1% or a 2% lead service line replacement plan when you have a trigger violation. So it doesn't have to be the 3% that's required by the action level violation, but the state is still going to approve that, hey, 1% is acceptable for your system or 2% is acceptable for your system. But same thing here, you've had a trigger level violation, your next round of sampling, you go back below the trigger level, you're still going to replace lead service lines for at least 2 years at the replacement rate in your plan. You've had that trigger level violation, you're going to do a corrosion control treatment study or a re-optimization study to make sure that you're feeding the right product or what you would add going forward. That would allow you to look at adjust pH or add a corrosion inhibitor. The federal rule doesn't require you to install it because it's just a trigger level violation, but it's prepping you for if you ever do have an action level, you'll now have all the data that you need, and you'll then have to install it once you get to an action level violation. Some states are already ahead of the game, requiring systems to do this ahead of time so that they already have that information when they have a trigger level violation for what they'll do going forward. There is some small system flexibility. So smaller systems have carve-outs where they can provide point of use filters and maintain them for their customers in the system, if that's a feasibility for them. They can take a tactic of doing lead service line replacement as their tactic to get into compliance. But once they begin down that path of lead service line replacement, they have to continue replacing lead service lines until they're all removed. So they can't take years off once they start down that path. Or they can choose to do corrosion control treatment and add that to the system. So there's multiple options that a small system can pick. And so that flexibility is built into the federal rule. For your sampling plan, you're going to see a lot of similarities to the 1991 rule and the 2024 rule. So it's still based on the size of your distribution system, but it's now targeted toward the high-risk sites. So it's going to be targeted toward all those samples coming from lead service lines if you have them. The frequency for this testing is going to be every 6 months for initial monitoring. If you continue and consistently meet the action level, you can reduce to monitoring to once a year at the standard number of sites. If you consistently are below the trigger level, then you'll be able to reduce monitoring to reduced number of sites and to every 3 years. So there's a benefit now in the new rule to being below the trigger level so that you can get back down to reduced monitoring. So what does it mean targeting lead service lines? So in the new 2024 rule, the tier criteria now changes for where you're going to pull samples from. The idea being that you're going to target only lead service lines if you have them in the system. So your tier 1 sites are going to be single family homes with known lead service lines on either the private side or the public side. And that's where all your sample sites are going to come from. So if you have to pull 40 samples from a system and you have 40 lead service lines, every one of your sample sites is going to be from a home with a lead service line. If you don't have 40 lead service lines in the system, then you would move down to fill the remaining ones with tier 2, which would be multifamily homes with lead service lines, and so on down the list. So if you don't have enough tier 1 sites to fill all of them, then you'll be able to pull in some tier 2. If you go through tier 1 and tier 2 and there's still not enough sites, You'll go to tier 3, which would be single family homes with galvanized that's currently or formerly preceded by lead. If you still don't have enough sites, you would go to tier 4, which would be single family home with copper pipes and lead solder. And then finally, tier 5, if you still don't have enough sites, it can just be a representative sample of plumbing in the system itself. The idea being in the new sampling plan with the new tiers, everything's going to be targeted toward those homes with lead service lines, if you have them. Now, the other part that changes when you go out and do the sampling is if you have no lead service lines, the sampling is going to stay the same. It'll be a sampling of the first draw for both copper and lead in those homes with no lead service lines. What that means is it'll be the first liter of water from a cold water tap that has not been used for a minimum of 6 hours. The rule does not have an upper limit on stagnation time, but ideally you want to pull that sample from a tap that hasn't been used somewhere in the 6 to 8 to 10 hour time frame. So you get an idea of what's happening when they wake up in the morning if they were to drink that first glass of water. And you also want to make sure that you use a tap that they use frequently. So kitchen sink, bathroom sink are pretty good places to pull from. If the home has a lead service line, the customer is going to pull 2 samples for you. So they're going to pull the first liter, which will be used for copper. And then they're going to use the 5th liter, and that's going to be used for lead. And that's the federal rule. Some states are going to require people to test for lead at both the 1st and 5th liter, but that's going to be a state rule, so you'll want to check with your local state to see what they're going to do. But the federal rule says 1st liter will be copper, 5th liter will be lead if there's a lead service line in the home, but the same criteria for cold water tap, not used for at least 6 hours. Now, how do you get that? The customer is actually going to get 5 1-liter sample bottles from you. You're going to pull liter 1, then they're going to pull 2, 3, and 4, pull liter 5, hand you back all 5 liters, and then you'll discard as a utility. You can discard liters 2, 3, and 4, and only use that 1st liter and that 5th liter for your sampling. Now, the new rule pulls out and specifies you can no longer tell the customer or put it in print that they can do pre-stagnation flushing the night before. What that means is you can't have information or tell the customer, hey, before you turn the tap off at night, we want you to open the faucet and flush it for 10 to 15 minutes prior to you shutting it off for the night to pull the sample in the morning. The idea behind this pre-stagnant flushing was it would actually flush particulate lead out of the pipe the night before, and so you'd have a much lower sample in the morning. The idea is if the consumer is not doing this, it's not something you should direct the customer to do, so it calls out that you can no longer do that. In addition, it tells you that you can no longer tell the customer to clean or remove the faucet aerator or filter that's on their faucet. If they operate that faucet with the filter attached, they're supposed to operate it when they pull the sample for you the exact same way. One of the interesting things that we've seen at Carus over the years is actually sometimes when customers actually remove the faucet area to clean it and put it back on, we'd actually see higher levels because we disturbed the pipe. And it wasn't necessarily always that we saw lower samples. But the idea is operate that faucet exactly like the customer does. It also now in the new rule requires wide mouth sample bottles to pull that 1-liter draw. They have to have approximately a 2-inch opening. The idea behind this is the customer is supposed to be directed to take a sample from that tap at the full flow velocity. So open the faucet up completely to pull that sample so you would flush any particulate lead into the sample bottle at the highest flow rate from that faucet. Now, there are some things you want to do under the 1991 rule and even under 2024. One of the issues is going to be it's going to be much harder at the state level to throw samples out. So you want to ensure that when you are pulling a sample from a customer site or having them pull it, that they have no treatment installed on that water line because they're changing water quality when they do that. So if the home has a water softener and it's a whole home water softener, that's going to be hard for you to get a good site with that water softener because it changes water quality, which can actually make the lead and copper numbers higher if you're downstream of it. If it's just a water softener that might be just on the kitchen sink, then maybe move to the bathroom sink as a viable option. You also want to check with them. Do they have a filtration unit? So do they have an under-the-counter filter like you see in the picture? Do they have a filter on that tap? Different brands have carbon filters. you want to make sure that they're not filtering the sample, because filtering can remove lead and copper from the sample tap, and so you get a low number. What you want to do is make sure you've documented all that before you've pulled the sample, so you've got a valid site. And then the idea is, once you start sampling at a customer site, you want to continue to use the same sample sites as much as possible to build up that history at that site of what's going on in the system as far as lead and copper numbers at those types of homes. But you do want to do some investigation with the customer to make sure what they have on the system, so they're not changing things on that water quality before you sample from them. Now, one of the things that Flint, Michigan taught EPA and people around the world was there's a lot of information that the public needs to know about what's happening with drinking water, and it's best to make sure the public is educated. So in the new rule, there's different things that are required by the EPA. In the federal rule, what you're now going to do is sample annually for 5 years at elementary schools in your area. The idea is you're going to pull 20% of the elementary schools, and then over the course of 5 years, you'll get to a full 100% of the elementary schools. Obviously, young children in elementary schools, so the target for lead there. You're going to pull 5 samples from each of those facilities. The idea of the 5 samples is it's going to target drinking water fountains, the place where they may cook if they do lunch there, and then maybe sinks that people use to fill their water bottles. It doesn't have to be every tap in the school. It just needs to be a minimum of 5 that children can pull water from or drink water from to get an idea of, is there a concern with lead? In addition, licensed child care facilities also in your area are going to have 20% of them pulled per year. You're going to pull 2 samples each, and the idea there would be the kitchen sink, the bathroom sink, because those could both be used to have formula or cook with or provide drinking water to the children at that child care facility. And same idea here, over 5 years, you'll get through all 100% in your area. Now, the rule calls out that this is only going to happen for 5 years. This data is then going to be reported to the EPA, and then the decision will be made based on what that data is out there of what's going to happen going forward. But there is, in the current rule for 2024, nothing that happens after this 5-year period. Now, secondary schools, so high schools, could request sampling. One of the other things you need to do, if you work with a school or a child care facility and they don't respond to you asking them about pulling the samples, or they refuse to pull the samples, you have to document that information, and it will count toward your 20% for that year if they've refused twice or non-responded twice to do this testing. In the federal rule, this testing does not have to be paid for by the water utility. You can help them. The idea is you help the school, you help the child care facility to pull the samples, you help them find a certified lab that they can send the samples to. You're required to gather that data and send it to the EPA, but you're not required to pay for it at the federal level for the schools and the child care facilities. In addition, for public education, you're going to be required as a water utility to provide annual info on lead and health risks, and there'll be updated information on the EPA website that will be available, so you can have that standard language that has all the requirements so that you can put it in your consumer confidence report. States might modify it or add to it, but there'll be some minimum language from the EPA. Now, in addition to that, the EPA says you may also include some other information for the customers. So you may include that you offer free testing to the consumers. So if a consumer is concerned about their home, you may offer free testing to them, or you may give them a list of EPA accredited labs. So make sure that they're using a certified lab so the lead result actually makes sense. I've heard a lot of people going online and buying test kits from eBay or Amazon or different websites online and getting completely erroneous results from them. So the idea is you want them to use the same lab that you would use to get good results. You may provide them assistance on sampling, how you would sample, where you would sample, things that they might need to know when they do that sampling. A review letter if you are doing testing, notifying them of the results, interpretation if you are providing that testing to the consumer so they know what there is. And hopefully on your website, some easy to find information or directions to the US EPA website so the customer can get information. The idea behind this is communication is going to be key to maintaining public confidence in drinking water. So get that information in their hands so they know what's going on. Part of the new 2020 rule is we don't know where all the lead service lines are in the US. So a major part of it is the lead service line inventory. It's mandatory for all systems, regardless of size, to do this inventory. Systems serving greater than 50,000 people must publish their lead service line inventory online. If you're under that 50,000 threshold, you can make it available, but it doesn't have to be online. So they could come to the office, they could come to City Hall, and they could request that inventory list, but it doesn't have to be published online unless you're over 50,000. You're also, every year when you do your consumer confidence report, you're going to include a statement on your lead service line inventory and what are the different types of lines that you have in the system and the number of them. And this information is going to be updated annually at the state level and then the federal level. And the idea is this is going to help us know what's out there as far as lead service lines, how much unknowns out there, and are we making progress toward getting the lead service lines out of the system. So this mandatory inventory at the federal level says you're going to do the number of lead lines that you have in the system, the number of galvanized lines requiring replacement, which means they've been downstream of lead either now or in the past. Lead status unknown, basically saying you don't know what that service line is. And then a category called non-lead, which can be any of the other materials. You're also supposed to include both the public and the private side of the service line. So in a lot of cases, municipalities, you only own the public side, but you're also going to need to know what the private side. So you're going to have to work with the homeowners to find out what both the public and private side are and continually update that information on an annual basis to the state government and to the US EPA. Now, a lot of states have taken this minimum inventory and added other things to it, because rather than just having a general non-lead, it would be nice to know, is it copper? Is it galvanized that doesn't require replacement? Is it PVC? What the actual material is. So you'll see a lot of states are developing systems for this inventory, and they're going to add additional information so that we have it going forward. So why are you doing this lead service line inventory? Well, the idea is to get the information to the US EPA of how many lead service lines and how much unknown is out there. But then it triggers the next part of the 2024 rule, which is the lead service line replacement. The plan is to replace all lead service lines and deal with all unknown service lines in the system. Ideally, in the future, we come to a place where there's no lead service lines, there's no unknowns, we know what the materials are going forward for the future. Under the replacement plan, unknowns now count as lead service lines for the total number of lead service lines in the system. So when you're looking at doing your replacement, it's going to be known lead service lines plus unknowns to get that total number. Now, your replacement plan will be two ways. You're going to have an agreed upon replacement rate with the state regulator if you're over the trigger level, and you're going to replace based on that plan for 2 years. If you're over the action level, it's going to be 3% minimum for those 2 years. Obviously, in both of these cases, you can replace more than the required percentage and you'll be fine, but you're going to have a minimum that you have to replace for at least 2 years while you're in violation. Keep in mind that 3% or your replacement plan, if you're under a trigger level violation, is going to be that times your unknowns plus your known lead service line. So it'll be a larger number that you'll actually have to replace in the system. As part of this replacement plan, you're going to have to plan for who pays for this. So who pays the public cost, who's going to pay the private costs of the homeowner, plan for low income lead service line replacement. So if they can't afford it, how are you going to get that lead service line replaced? You may have all sorts of options you may discuss as a water utility with your city. You may decide that you're going to replace all the lead service lines at the utility cost, but then add a fee to everybody's bill. You may provide a loan to customers so they replace their side while you redo yours. But you're going to have to discuss all those options in the next 2 years going forward, so you know how you're going to pay for this going forward. even if it includes the homeowner paying for their side, you want to have that information out there. Now, the only thing that counts for a lead service line replacement is a full actual replacement, which means both the public and the private side has to be replaced in order for it to count towards your percentage for replacement. Meaning if you replace your side as the public utility and the homeowner doesn't replace their side, that will not count as a replacement for your system. So you're going to want to get that buy-in from the customer so that when you do the replacement, both sides are replaced at the same time or as close to the same time as possible, and then you'll get credit for that replacement. Also, if you decide to go dig up an unknown line and it turns out that it's not lead, that will not count as a replacement. So you're really going to want to do for your replacement your known lead service lines first so that you get credit, and then move to your unknown lines second. Ideally, though, you're uncovering your unknown lines in the next 2 years and figuring out what they are through customer surveys, through information that you collect as the water utility, so that unknown list is much, much smaller. But the idea is you're going to get the lead service lines out with the replacement, so really the focus should be on known lead service lines first, and then move to your unknown second. There is no test out provision for this replacement based on sampling. So you failed the lead and copper rule, well, either the trigger level or action level, you are going to be mandated to do lead service line replacement. You can't then pass the test and say, well, now we're not going to replace. You're going to have to do that replacement. After the replacement, the rule calls out that you're going to provide the customer a pitcher filter within 24 hours of that replacement, and also provide them 6 months of filters so they can change those filters out so they can use that to drink and cook with. The idea being a lot of information has shown that after lead service lines have been removed from a system, that there is a spike in lead levels in those homes because you disturb the plumbing. The idea being the pitcher filter gets us through that period where the lead levels go back to normal, and so there's not that extra exposure from removing the lead service line at those homes. Now, if a homeowner were to call you and say they're going to replace their lead service line, which obviously helps you, if they call to say they're going to do it, you as a utility must replace your portion within 45 days of the homeowner saying they're going to do their side. So even if you're not under a replacement program, you don't have to do replacement. If a homeowner says they're doing their side, you're required as a system to do your side within 45 days. Because there are cold weather states and there can be issues, you can notify the state and it can extend that timeline to 180 days for the public side to be changed. But just keep in mind, if a homeowner decides to do their side, you as a utility are going to have to do your side as well. In addition to lead service line inventory, the changes to the sampling plan, the lead service line replacements, there's also a lot of new language about corrosion control treatment. Under the current 2024 rule, pH adjustment counts, chemical inhibitors count, and phosphates do count, but it has to have orthophosphate in it at a minimum of 1 or 3 milligrams per liter. Silicates also count. Calcium hardness under the new rule is no longer an option for corrosion control treatment. So just keep in mind, in 2024, the acceptable corrosion control treatments are going to be pH adjustment and a chemical inhibitor with orthophosphate in it or a silicate. One of the things the rule calls out is that you must install corrosion control treatment regardless of other factors that it may affect. So one of the things that the EPA knows, and has come up during listening sessions as well, is that the EPA knows that if you do adjust the pH higher, that it could cause disinfection byproducts in the drinking water system. And we'll talk about that further, but the idea is that lead is a primary rule. We want to make sure lead and copper levels are low in the system, and so whatever you do that's the best treatment for lead and gets you the lowest lead numbers, that's what you're going to want to target, and then you'll have to treat for the other things that it may cause as a byproduct of you installing that treatment. So in the case of pH adjustment, if it does cause disinfection byproduct issues, you'll have to look at other options to lower those. If you're adding a chemical inhibitor that's phosphate-based, that will impact the wastewater plant because it will add some total phosphorus to the wastewater plant. But if it's the best treatment, you're going to add it, and then the wastewater plant will have to change their treatment to make sure they get removal. Now, if you choose pH alkalinity adjustment, what they're really looking for is the pH adjustment based on optimal corrosion control treatment. There's a lot of options you can choose, but by far probably the two most common that you're going to see for pH adjustment are going to be lime and caustic soda. Those will typically adjust the pH significantly in the system, while lime also adds calcium and hydroxide alkalinity to the system. If you have a low alkalinity, low hardness water, then something like soda ash or sodium bicarbonate, which adds alkalinity, will also adjust the pH up as well. But with all these chemicals, what you're going to do is you're going to have a new pH target. So if you're currently at pH 7.5 and you're out of compliance, and you find that targeting pH 8.5 gets you into compliance with lead and copper rule, well, your optimized corrosion control treatment will now be going to pH 8.5 or above if you install it. So the goal is to meet those requirements from your corrosion control treatment to make sure you get back into compliance. Now, why does the EPA call out the issue with pH? Well, there's been studies shown that depending on the pH of the water and using free chlorine does affect disinfection byproducts. The amount of hypochlorite ion that is formed is dependent on the pH, so higher pHs form more of that. And higher total trihalomethane formation potential occurs at pH 9 versus a lower pH like 5. So if you're moving from 7.5 to say 8.5 or 9, that's going to increase your THMs in the system. Newport News, Virginia, was investigating corrosion control strategies for lead and copper. And what they were looking at was they were going to raise the pH from 7 to 8 in their finished water. They were a surface water plant. They added aluminum polymer for coagulation, and they pH adjusted with lime, hardness around 70. What they looked at is if they did the pH from 7 to 8, it would increase trihalomethane formation potential by 25%. So when they did the jar test, it was showing about a 25% increase in THM formation potentials. When they looked at data from the system, THMs would actually go up by about 40%. So actually more in the real world versus the formation potential test. What that would mean is they would not comply with the US EPA THM standard as part of the disinfection byproduct. Now, this pH change, though, they found would also let them now meet the lead and copper action levels. So it was going to get them in compliance with lead action levels. And they did have other options. So they considered moving from free chlorine to monochlorine because that would lower their THMs in the system and they would get into compliance with the disinfection byproduct rule and the lead and copper rule by making that change. What the utility ultimately concluded at the end was they decided that a phosphate corrosion control program would be the best choice. They installed it. The THMs and HAAs stayed below the MCLs in the system with the phosphate addition, and the lead and copper action levels were below the action level for the US EPA. So that was their choice. But they could have done either way to get in compliance. It's just a matter of what other changes they were going to make in the system. Like I said, EPA also talked about that you're going to add to the wastewater plant if you add phosphorus on the drinking water side. A typical wastewater plant will typically have a varying influent load, somewhere between 4 and 10 milligrams per liter, some systems slightly higher, some systems slightly lower. On the wastewater side, we measure phosphorus as P, and it's a total number. Typically, when we talk about drinking water, we're talking about total phosphate. So there is a difference between phosphate and phosphorus, and it's just a math difference. So in drinking water, we add 1 to 3 milligrams per liter as total phosphate is PO4. What that will end up being is you divide by 3 roughly, and you'll get the actual number as total phosphorus is P. So really a 1 to 3 dosage as phosphate on drinking water is really only 0.33 to 1 milligram per liter as P. One thing that systems have seen that turning off the drinking water phosphate will not be enough and won't get you to the low levels for the permit as those levels are turned down at the wastewater plant. We have many systems that have a limit of 1 milligram per liter that has moved to 0.3 or 0.1 or lower based on the river or stream they're discharging to, and turning off the drinking water phosphate is not going to get them to that new low limit. Well, why is that? Well, there are a lot of variations in the total phosphorus content coming in, and typically they're much larger than the amount you're adding. So if you're only adding 1 part, you're only adding really 0.33, and during the course of the year, you'll see a swing of a couple milligrams per liter on the total phosphorus coming into the wastewater plant. Typically, those variations at a wastewater plant, so say one day or 1 month they average a 4, and the next month they average a 5, they typically see the same removal efficiency based on the process they have. So if they're consistently getting below 1 milligram per liter, it doesn't matter in a lot of cases if there are 4 parts to start with or 5 parts, their system just always consistently removes it to that goal of 1. If they have to go to those lower levels, then it's also going to talk about what other treatment schemes they might have to add at the wastewater plant. What we've seen with systems that we've worked with is a lot of times they're going to have to either enhance their biological process to get to that 0.3 or that 0.1. They might have to add a chemical for precipitation to get to that 0.3 or 0.1 level. And some systems where they have even levels below 0.1 might actually have to add final filtration at the end of the system to get to that level. So you're going to have to add multiple things to the wastewater plant, and that's regardless of what's going on in the drinking water side. You might have to add those at the wastewater plant to be in compliance. So where does all the phosphorus come from in the wastewater plant? Well, some of the common uses of phosphates is phosphates are a food additive. They're a leavening agent in donuts and bread. They're a dairy emulsifier in cheese, so on your cheeseburger or pizza. They're in the can of soda that you drink, sometimes greater than 1%. So a lot of the phosphorus that goes to a wastewater plant is coming from 2 sources. It's coming from food or from human waste that includes phosphorus after we've eaten the food. Now, there are some additional sources in wastewater as well. By far, the largest part is coming from food and human waste. But it can also come from pharmaceutical additives. They're in toothpaste as a plaque inhibitor and a whitening agent. They are in some drugs. Fertilizers, by far, one of the largest portions of phosphorus. They're 80% of the global demand. And then phosphate is also included in some cleaners and detergents because they're very effective at sequestering and removing stains. So there's a lot of different sources out there that go to the wastewater plant that include phosphorus. On the drinking water side, we're really adding phosphate for one of 2 main applications. We're adding it for corrosion control to make sure that we're in compliance with lead and copper rule, or we're adding it as a sequestering agent to tie up iron and manganese so we have color control, or we're using it for calcium carbonate scale control in that situation. AWWA has done studies, and just over half of all water utilities in the US use some type of phosphate-based corrosion control for treatment in the system. The AWARF study, the last time it was done, said there was about $200 million spent annually on phosphate products in the US, and that resulted in a $4 billion in savings, or a 20-fold return on investment. How AWARF came up with that is, you're doing this treatment, but if you do treatment and you have optimized corrosion control, you don't have to do extra lead and copper sampling. You don't have to do extra flushing in the system because it's under corrosion control. You don't have a lot of leaks in main breaks. So all that extra stuff as a water operator that you do and respond to customer complaints based on corrosion, those all go away if you have optimized corrosion control. So there's less things that you do. So the cost of the chemicals do pay themselves back. Now, like I said, for phosphates, there really is kind of 3 main applications. Phosphates are used for calcium carbonate scale control. So obviously you can see the pipe there with the calcium carbonate scale. It's never going to corrode, but obviously you're eventually not going to get any water through it. But more typically, hard water spots from hard water on dishes after we wash them, right? So you can see that glass, you can't see with it, you've got the hard water film. For small systems that have groundwater and they don't do removal of iron and manganese, if they take that iron and manganese and send it to the system with chlorination, it's going to oxidize, which means it's going to precipitate, and it's going to cause color. You're either going to have red to brown colored water out there in the system, depending on if it's iron or manganese. And the idea being you can sequester the iron and manganese and then chlorinate, and the water will stay clear. The customer can drink low levels of iron and manganese. There are no negative health effects from low levels, but you won't have the discolored water or the aesthetic complaints in the system based on that water precipitating. And then finally, obviously, we talked about this at the beginning, make sure that you're in compliance with the lead and copper rule at the consumer's tap as well. Now, how do we pick a phosphate product? And why are there 2 different types? Well, if the system has no iron and manganese, and it has a very low hardness and alkalinity, typically what you're looking at is you're looking at an orthophosphate or a zinc orthophosphate to form a film on the inside of the pipe to provide protection. So that's how you're going to lower your lead and copper levels in that type of system. In the case of something where you have a scale issue or you have iron and manganese you tie up, some of those systems use a straight polyphosphate, and all they're using it for is for sequestering. They're not really providing much corrosion control at that point. Some systems require both, so you'll have a blended poly-orthophosphate. Your corrosion control is going to be based on how much orthophosphate's in the product and how high are you feeding it, and your poly level is going to be based on how much stuff you sequester. That blend ratio can change based on the system and your water quality parameters. So one of the things when I'm picking a product, it's going to be based specifically on your water quality. So what iron and manganese, what hardness do you have to sequester? And then if you're having lead and copper issues, how much orthophosphate are you then going to add with that blend as well? Do you require 1 part? Do you require 2 parts? Do you require 3 parts to get the lead and copper number lower so you're in compliance? A case study for here, just like the pH adjustment one, system had levels above 50 parts per billion in some taps, and their 90th percentile was at 23 parts per billion. Their treatment approach, because they wanted to get back into compliance as quickly as possible, was they were going to use a 15 poly 85 ortho blended phosphate. They were going to feed a minimum of 3.2, which was going to give them an orthophosphate about 2.7 in the system. The plant operation for this system was a groundwater filtration plant with 5 wells blended together. They did have iron removal, and they treated about 1.2 mgd on average. Water quality for this system, pH in the mid-7s, 7.3 to 7.5. Iron after treatment for removal, 0.04 to 0.01, so very low. Manganese below 0.05, so very low. Hardness and alkalinity in the system, you can see in the mid-300s for the hardness, which is why they wanted some poly, because they wanted to prevent some calcium carbonate scaling, but they wanted to have enough polyphosphate to provide sequestering for that hardness and then enough ortho for the lead levels. So they decided they were going to install this treatment at the same time they were going to do corrosion control testing. The coupons that they collected in the system, and they looked at mild steel lead and copper coupons, showed a reduction in the lead corrosion rates of approximately 50%. When they went and did their first draw sampling in the system, they showed a 90% reduction in their first draw samples. Their highest lead after 1 year was 12 parts per billion, and they eventually went down to reduce moderating. So if you look at it prior to the phosphate addition in year 0, their highest tap sample was 50, and their 90th percentile was 23, so over that 15 part per billion level. 1 year down the road, their highest level tap had dropped from 50 to 18, and their 90th percentile had dropped from 23 to 2. Year 2, the highest level in the system dropped from 18 to 12. So now every sample in the system was below 15. And the 90th percentile still hovered around 2, so well within compliance. So it's showing the benefit of adding the phosphate long-term and showing reduction in the system for those lead levels and even the highest lead samples in the system over time. So, multiple ways to get into corrosion control treatment. So if you're a system that does not have corrosion control treatment, and say your size is over 50,000 and you have no lead service lines, well, you can recommend corrosion control treatment, but the state could also then carve out and say they actually want you to do a corrosion control study to determine what your optimized corrosion control treatment would be going forward. If you're over 50,000 and you have lead service lines, you're going to be required to do a corrosion control study so you have that information so that you can install the corrosion control treatment if you do have a violation of the action level. If you're under 50,000 and over the action level, it does split out a little bit. So if you have lead service lines, you are going to do a corrosion control study. But if you're under 50 and have no lead service lines and had an action level violation, the state will allow you to recommend corrosion control treatment, or they still could require you to do that corrosion control study. So you're going to want to check with the state agency. So what this corrosion control treatment option says is it's going to require systems without corrosion control treatment to perform a corrosion control study if they're over the trigger level, and then implement that corrosion control treatment if they're over the action level. But there are some differences based on size and what the state sets up. If you're a system that has corrosion control treatment, so you've already installed it, they want to make sure that you're installed based on what your corrosion control study. So if you have that information from when you originally did your pH or phosphate or silicate addition, what you're going to want to make sure is that you're installed at that level. So if your goal was to have a pH of 8.5, that's the pH that you're targeting in your system. So you're based on what your corrosion control study. If you have a trigger level violation, you're going to do corrosion control study reoptimization. So obviously your plan's not working, you've had a trigger level violation, so let's reoptimize your corrosion control treatment and see, do we need to go to a higher pH? Do we need to change from pH adjustment to phosphate addition? Do we need to change to a silicate? What's the best option going forward? If you're over 50,000 and you're under the trigger level and you're under the action level, so you're not in violation, the state still decides on that corrosion control study. A lot of states are already requiring corrosion control studies by their largest systems. The idea, larger systems serve more people, get that information ready, so in case you have to make a change, you've already got it. Now that corrosion control study calls out exactly what you're going to do. If you have known lead service lines in your system and you are over the action level, it's going to require that you do a harvested lead service line pipe loop, and you run that pipe loop for a 1-year-long study to collect that data. If you're over the trigger level, the state gets to decide if it's a harvested lead service line pipe loop. There are alternatives. You can do coupons, partial system tests, analysis system tests to basically determine other ways for your corrosion control study if you're over the trigger level but under the action level. If your system has no lead service lines and you have an action level violation, well, you could do a lead service line loop, but because you don't have lead service lines, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do a lead service line loop. You most likely will do a coupon or a partial system test or an analogous system test where you get data from a system that's similar to yours to gather that data for what your corrosion control study will be. In addition to both the corrosion control study, the corrosion control treatment that you might have to install, there are water quality parameters that you're going to have to start measuring in the system. And those are going to include measuring pH and alkalinity, and then if you're adding an orthophosphate, what the orthophosphate level is. If you're adding a silicate, what is the silica level in the system. If you're a system over 50,000, you're going to conduct regular water quality parameter monitoring at the entry point and within the distribution system. If you're under 50,000, you're going to conduct that water quality parameter monitoring at sites until your lead and copper are below the action level for 2 consecutive 6-month periods. For reduced monitoring for those water quality parameters, you must be below the trigger level and you must be meeting your optimal water quality parameters. So as you're collecting those samples, if your pH drops below 8.5 and that's your target, well, now you're not meeting your optimal parameters, so you're going to continue to do that testing. So you need to make sure that you're above the levels that you state you're going to be at. So if your ortho is 1 or your pH is 8.5, you need to be above that. You also need your lead and copper numbers to be below the trigger level and action level so you can be in compliance. Now, the last part of the rule here is going to be the find and fix provision. If a tap sample in your compliance pool is over the action level, you're going to be required to notify that specific customer of the result. What that means is you might not have an action level or even a trigger level violation for your system, but one of your samples that you pulled in the system for one home is over that action level. You're going to notify that customer of what that level is, and then that they're over the action level at their tap. You're then going to be required to conduct water quality parameter monitoring at or near that site to see if you're at your optimal parameters for water quality. You're also going to follow up with a lead and copper tap sample from that exact same tap that you pulled the compliance sample from to see if the number holds true. And then you're going to want to look at performing corrective action. So it's finding what caused the issue with the water quality and lead and copper and doing investigation of what possibly caused the issue. And then if it's a lead service line that you find, then that's something you'll work with the homeowner to replace the lead service line. If it's something like a fixture, well, then you can provide that information to the homeowner and say they need to change out their fixture, or if it's their copper plumbing with lead solder, make the suggestion to them that they replace that as well. The utility is not responsible to replace the fixture or the home plumbing. It's just the lead service line that you're responsible for. There could be other options. You might tell them that they can use a filter because it's from the home fixture. You're also going to want to, when you're doing this find and fix, you're going to document customer refusal to help you or non-response after 2 attempts. So you tell the customer the result, they refuse to help you do any type of investigation to see what the issue is. You're going to report that back to the state so they have that information that you do your due diligence to try to help the customer. And you're going to provide that information to the state and local public health officials, so maybe you can get somebody else to help them lower their numbers at those sample caps. The idea with this is, with the find and fix, is that anybody that has a high sample that's in your compliance pool, you're going to try to fix it going forward so that they have a low number in the next round of testing. Now, we've covered a lot of information in this last hour, and a lot of this information is available on the US EPA website under the revised lead and copper rule. A lot of the graphics you saw with pictures of the 1st and 5th liter are directly from the US EPA documents. And so you can get those, and those are handouts that you can use for your utility. If you want to read the complete Federal Register lead and copper rule revisions, it's out there as well, along with an 8-pager that goes through all the different steps and the changes from the current 1991 rule to 2024. But all that information is available out there, along with the information that we provided you today. There is my contact information, my phone number, and my email. And I'm going to hand this back to Ashley.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Thanks everyone for joining. We're going to go ahead and we have a few questions that have been submitted. If you do have additional questions, feel free to submit those now. Darren, when replacing lead service lines, are partial lead service line replacements allowed?
They are not. So the way the rule is written is, if you do a partial replacement, it doesn't count as an actual full lead service line replacement. So it will still stay in your sampling pool. So you'll still pull from it for compliance. So the idea is you're going to try to do everything under your power to get that customer to agree to do the full replacement on their side. So you really want to avoid those. So.
Okay, and which grades are included in elementary school?
So elementary school, I'll have to look it up. I believe it's first or kindergarten through 5th grade is what counts as an elementary school. And it will include combined schools. So I was in Kansas last week, and one of the things they mentioned, if it's a school that's kindergarten through high school, you'll sample from that because it's all the grades, and it'll count toward your elementary schools. But I believe, and I can get back to you, that it's kindergarten through 5th grade.
Okay, great. We had a couple requests for the recording of the webinar, so we did record this and we'll get it out to you. It looks like we have a couple more that just came in. What are the guidelines for lead and copper corrosion coupon rate?
So there's no guideline for the lead and copper corrosion rates on coupons. What you're really looking for is the difference between your treatment prior to your corrosion control and your treatment after. So in most cases, you'll have 2 sets of coupons. You'll have one that's your finished water with everything in it but your pH adjustment or but your phosphate, and then you'll have another one downstream. And what you're looking for is a drop in corrosion rates. Now, there are some numbers that are out there for lead and copper and for mild steel corrosion rates that show, like, lead and copper will have much lower corrosion rates than mild steel, but what you're really trying to target is just the number trends downward and how significant is that downward trend. And then that'll give you an idea of what's happening in the system.
Okay, perfect. I think that's it for now. Thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you, Darren, for the presentation. Everyone have a great rest of your day.